This tutorial is for Clue 1 of the Purport pattern by Janica Carter, which is the Expression Fiber Arts 2025 year-long mystery knit-along pattern. I want to first recommend, if you're not watching this on YouTube, for instance, if you're watching this on Ravelry, you're going to want to click the front of the video and then either click on the title up at the top of the video or the little YouTube logo down at the bottom of the video, which will take you over to YouTube and open the video there. And once you've opened the video in YouTube, you can click on the more under the title of the video, and it will open all of the timestamps that are in the video description, so you can jump to just what you want to see and not have to watch anything you don't. I want to make it clear as well, nothing you see here has been blocked. I have only pinned out what has been worked. Nothing's been wet, nothing's been blocked. You want to wait to block your project until you have finished Clue 12. Next, I need to make it clear that for this tutorial, I will be using thicker yarn and bigger needles than the pattern actually calls for. So the sole reason for this is because the recommended yarn for this project, the Expression Fiber Arts Oasis Camel Silk Fingering yarn, is a very shiny, very thin yarn, and when paired with my metal needles, makes it almost impossible for you to see what I'm doing. So for that reason only, I will be using Expression Fiber Arts Dewy DK in the colorway Velvet Snowflake, and I will be pairing that with a US 9 or a 5.5 millimeter needle, so you can see exactly what you need to see as I work this tutorial. I do want to make clear I am an English style knitter. I hold my working yarn in my right hand. So if you are a continental style knitter, if you hold your yarn in your left hand, for at least the parts where you're making the yarn over at the beginning of a new needle, go watch Shandy's official Expression Fiber Arts Clue 1 tutorial for this, because that's going to make a whole lot more sense than what I'm doing. I would recommend sticking around for the recommendations I'm going to give you for getting started on this, but I would recommend her video specifically to see how to make the stitches, especially at the beginning of this project. Since this particular pattern begins with a very tiny circle, you're going to either need to use double pointed needles to get started, or magic loop to get started, or possibly use 2 long circulars to get started. So I wanted to say, if you are using the 2 long circulars method, you're going to want to pay attention to the double pointed needles part of this video and not the magic loop part of this video, as that will be closer to what you're actually doing if you're using 2 long circulars. To avoid this being a super long video, I'm not demonstrating every single round of the project. I will be demonstrating how to do 4 different cast on options. I'm going to do a pinhole cast on with a crochet hook, a pinhole cast on with a knitting needle, a long tail cast on, and Judy's improved magic cast on. Following that, I'm going to show how to get started if you're using DPNs. I'm going to show how to get started if you're using magic loop. I'll demonstrate multiple pattern rounds on both of those methods. I'll give you some suggestions that you can work on round 3 that will help simplify the rest of this clue. I'll talk through working the repeated parts of this pattern, and I'm going to discuss when you can move to a small circular setup instead of using magic loop or DPNs. As usual, if I miss anything, if there's something you'd like to see that isn't here, just leave me a comment or contact me over on Ravelry. Let me know, and I will do my best to make a video showing you what you'd like to see. So let's get started with the actual tutorial now. So the image you've been staring at here is my actual Clue 1. This is worked with Oasis Camel Silk Fingering yarn that was Late Night Storm as the colorway, worked on the US 5 or the 3.75 millimeter needles. I did this using a pinhole cast on. And so I'm going to be demonstrating how to do 2 different methods to do a pinhole cast on. I'm going to do one with a crochet hook and one that you can do with your knitting needles. There's really like 4 or 5 that I know of different ways to do a pinhole cast on. So this is not the be all end all. If you don't like mine, go find another one. But so this is the one that was done using a crochet hook. And what it does is it gives you this nice tight circle in the center. If you like that, if you like the center of your whether you call it a pinwheel or a flower, this motif that's in this first clue. If you like that center to be closed down, you can start with a pinhole cast on, and it'll just be a ring that you can pull tight. And then when you weave in your ends, it'll stay nice and closed down. So that is one option for cast on, and I'm going to show you 2 ways to do it, both with a crochet hook and with knitting needles. This is what you would get if you do a traditional long tail cast on. So you can see you still have the pinwheel or the flower, but the center is open. Now, the long tail cast on is probably the simplest way to start this clue. And so if you like the closed center look, but you want to start with a long tail cast on, there is a way to use your tail to actually tighten down the center so that it looks more closed. So if you're interested in doing that, if you did a long tail cast on, you got the hole, you're like, no, I don't want the hole. Let me know. I'm happy to make a video showing how I would close up the center of this cast on so that it looks more like the pinhole cast on if you like that look. The long tail cast on does leave this traditionally like a hole in the center of your work, which some people like. So that's actually another option, is to just do the long tail cast on and leave it like that. I don't know if anybody's going to want it. I actually like the way this looks. So this was done using Judy's Improved Magic Cast On as the way to cast on the stitches in the center. So yes, it kind of looks closed in the center, but also it kind of doesn't. But if you look at the petals of the pinwheel or the flower, they kind of curve into their opposite. I don't know if you can see that. So they kind of curve over and they kind of twist here in the center. So Judy's Improved Magic Cast On, or just Judy's Magic Cast On, is typically used for toe-up socks, to like do that line across the very toe of the sock. And I used it here to start the pinwheel, or to start clue 1. And I like the way it looks, so I am going to demonstrate that cast on. I would say out of all the cast on options, the Judy's Improved Magic Cast On is probably going to be the most difficult to work from. That's because this particular cast on is an unstable cast on, and it's not until you work the first several stitches after casting on the stitches that you actually secure the stitches in place. So I will be demonstrating that as well, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what you're going to get if you do each cast on. Okay, so the first cast on is the pinhole cast on using a crochet hook. I do recommend that you go down in size on your crochet hook, at least a full millimeter size smaller than your knitting needles. So I actually have it's a 3.75 millimeter hook, and I'm putting my stitches on a 5.5 millimeter needle. So it just kind of depends on if you're using the yarn that Shandy recommends. I'd use like an A hook. Very, very small. Use a very, very small hook to make your initial stitches, and then put them on your needle, because you are going to end up with bigger stitches made with the crochet hook than actually fit on your needle. So if you don't want extra large loops at the beginning, start with a very small hook. Okay, so to do a pinhole cast on with a crochet hook, you're going to start with what is called a magic loop. So if you don't crochet, take the tail of your working yarn, pinch it on the inside of your hand, kind of up against like your ring finger, and then wrap the yarn around your finger, around 3 fingers. So what I do is I wrap, so I have the wrap from the inside, and then I wrap once again around the outside, and then I come over with a third. Okay, so you don't have to do 2. You could just do 1. You could do 1 wrap and then bring the second one over. I like the look of having 2 wraps. It's going to create more of like a donut in the center instead of like a horseshoe. Okay, so if you do 2 wraps, you're going to get a donut in the center. If you do 1 wrap, you're going to get a little opening at one end. So I do 2 wraps. So you're going to bring that third wrap. So the first 2, you can see they're lined up. Nothing's crossing. And then that third one is going to cross over both. So I just kind of, I bring it over, grab it with my pinky, and then I'm going to come under the 2 straight ones, and then grab that third one and just bring it under. Okay. Then I can grab, I'm going to pinch everything right where that loop is and let go. And I'm going to grab my working yarn. and then I'm going to yarn over and I'm going to pull through one. So that's going to be my first stitch. And then for each stitch, I'm going to go under this whole ring. So I'm just going to kind of put that ring around my fingers. You can see my tail's coming over here to the left. So I'm going to go under the ring, grab a loop and pull it up, and then go into that. So yarn over, pull a loop through that. Go under that ring, grab a loop and pull it over, or pull it underneath, and then yarn over my hook and pull it through that stitch I just made. All right, so I'm just going to do this until I have all 8 stitches on my little ring here. So under, grab it, pull it under, yarn over and pull it through. So once you have 8 stitches on your crochet hook, you can slide them down to the other end, which is what I like to do. Be aware that your stitches are mounted here backwards from how they need to go on your needle. So as you go into each stitch to pick it up, whether you're picking it up with a long circular like I'm doing here, or if you're picking it up with a double pointed needle, you're going to want to come into the back of the stitch, like from left to right behind the stitch through it to slide it onto the needle. Otherwise, your first set of stitches are going to be mounted backwards. So I've got all my stitches here on my crochet hook. And what I'm going to do is for magic loop, I'm going to move 4 stitches and then slide them down the needle and then move 4 stitches. If you're doing DPNs, you basically want to move 4 stitches and then get another needle and put the other 4 stitches. So again, I'm coming in to the back of the stitch, coming behind the stitch, and then coming into the back from left to right, and then just slipping that off the end of the crochet hook onto my needle. So I'm going to slip 4, and then I'm just going to slide those down my needle. So if I had slipped those 4 onto one DPN, I basically want to just grab my next DPN and do what I'm doing here, which is getting the next 4 and slipping them the same way. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So now I have 4 stitches on the needle. I can kind of look at the inside loop that I've created here. I just want to make sure that's on a nice row, that I haven't like twisted anything around, that I haven't introduced any kind of turn into that, because I don't want to make a Mobius. I want to make a circle. Then I'm going to pull my tail out here so that it's straight, and I'm going to tug that ever so slightly to see which of these 2 rings is going to tighten. So let's see. So I've got this kind of less tight strand is what's pulling, and so I'm going to actually pull on the other end of that to tighten this ring first. So I'm going to tighten one ring down. All right, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it until I can pull my needles parallel. Then I'm going to grab the tail and I'm going to pull that. So you could try to grab the tail. It's just going to be a little bit tougher to get that ring to tighten entirely. But because I have that extra loop in there, what it does is it finishes the ring. If I didn't have that extra loop in there, it would just look like a horseshoe now. It would have an actual, there'd be an opening right there at the end. So that's why I do the 2 rings. Okay, so once you've pulled your tail, you want to basically flip your needles so you should have a side where all the strands are going into the ring, and you should have a side that has purl bumps on the inside, and that's what you want. You want your purl bumps facing up. You want the tail of your working yarn to be coming to the right, and then you can just kind of pull your other tail out of the way. All right, so to get started, you're just going to have your stitches on your needle. I poke them down in between so that I can pull the needles down together, like so. So whether you have all your stitches on magic loop or on double pointed needles, this is what it should look like once you are ready to get started working glue on after you've got your setup on there. So working yarn to the right, tail, I like to pull mine to my left. It's just easier to get it out of the way, and needles together with the purl bumps pressed up against each other to start. Okay, so if you're doing DPNs, it should look exactly like this. You just won't have the cable attached to the end. Okay, how to do a pinhole cast on with just your knitting needles. Now, there are multiple ways to do this. I'm going to demonstrate the way that I like to do it. There are other ways on YouTube, so feel free to, if you don't like the way I'm doing it, feel free to do it your way. So when I do a pinhole cast on with just my knitting needles, I take the tail of my working yarn and I bring it from the front over the back of my left hand, and I'm actually going to come around my hand twice. So I want a total of 2, 3. So I want to see 3 strands here, and then I have this loose strand should be the closest to my palm. Okay, so I've got my tail. I'm just kind of cinching it back here with my pinky. So none of these strands are really crossing. You can see they're kind of straight all the way back. And then I'm going to take my knitting needle. So this works whether you're using magic loop or you're doing double pointed needles. You can just take one end of your circular, or you can take one DPN. First thing you want to do is go under the working yarn. So working yarn is here. You're going to go under your working yarn like you're making a yarn over, and then bring your needle back and come under those 2 strands. So you can see I create a little gap between my fingers here. Go under that gap, and then I'm going to scoop under that yarn. All right, and I'm just going to do this a bunch of times. So go under that working yarn first, go under here, scoop down through the working yarn, and bring it back out. So each one of those is creating a stitch on the needle. So I'm do a yarn over, under the ring, over the working yarn to scoop it out. So it's going to be kind of tight. You may feel like as you're moving down, you need to like scoop between different fingers. But let's see, I've got 6, so do that one more time. So I'm going to under the working yarn and then go under that ring and then scoop that working yarn out. So now I have 8 stitches on my needle. Now this is a little unstable when you get to this point. All right, so you can cinch down your ring at this point, like before you move stitches. I would recommend it just because nothing's going to be real solid. So I like to do 2. You could do that with just 1 ring. You could go around and then a second time. The reason I do it 3 times is because I like to create a donut in the middle where it's a closed circle. If you just do it twice, you're going to end up with what looks like a horseshoe. You're going to have an open-ended center. So I pull on my tail a little bit to see which strand is tightening. And then it's this strand, so I grab the other end of that strand and I'm going to tighten that first ring. I'm going to tighten 1 ring at a time. So I'm going to tighten 1 ring down most of the way. And what that's going to do is that's going to kind of hold all my stitches in place. Okay, so at this point, I can move stitches to another needle if I want to before I finish tightening it down, or I can just tighten it all the way down. I like to kind of do it one stage at a time, just so that once I have all my stitches on both needles, everything can be cinched really snug. So at this point, if you are on DPNs, what you want to do is slide your stitches this way to the right side of your needle and transfer 4 of them tip to tip to your other needle. If you are using a circular, pull all your stitches down onto your cable. And this is just what I like to do. So the cables are resilient for the most part, but I've had enough instances where I've accidentally pinched a little kink into my cable that I don't grab the cable anymore, or I don't pinch the cable together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find 4 stitches and 4 stitches, and I'm going to put a plastic locking stitch marker on the cable between those 4 stitches. And then I'm going to kind of bend my cable, and I'm going to grab my stitches in one hand and my stitch marker in the other hand, so that it's just going to tug on the cable a little bit less pinchy. All right, so it's going to make a bend in the cable instead of a kink. And then just pull all those stitches down onto your needles. And you can take the stitch marker off the cable if you want. Don't need it. And once you have all your stitches on both needles, you can go ahead and tug again on that one end just to cinch down the the inside ring, and then tug on your tail to cinch down the rest. So if you do the pinhole cast on with just your knitting needles, it doesn't create as obvious a right side. So you can grab your working yarn and pull and see which stitch that's attached to, because you want it to be the stitch on your back needle that's furthest to the right. So you can find it that way. You can also look, so on one side it should just look like strands going into the center. On the other side you should be able to find at least one and maybe a couple of purl looking bumps. But basically you want your working yarn coming from that last stitch on the back needle that's on the right side, and get your tail out of the way. I like to actually pull my tail down to the left and between the needles, and then pull my working yarn from the other side, and then just pull everything so that the needles are pulled together. And that's your setup for how you want to have, how you want to start after doing a pinhole cast on with just your knitting needles. So whether you're working with magic loop or DPNs, this is kind of what you want to see when you get started. Working yarn should be coming to the right, needles should be close together, and it's you should just be sure that your working yarn is coming from that last stitch on the right that's on the back needle, the needle that's further away from you. So that is a pinhole cast on with just a knitting needle. And from there, you can just jump to starting clue 1. So to do a long tail cast on with, whether you're doing DPNs or magic loop, I would recommend casting on all 8 stitches to one needle, and then either putting them on the cable if you're using magic loop, dividing them, and then sliding back up onto the needles, or sliding 4 from the right tip to purlwise to the left tip of a second needle. I don't use a slip knot when I do long tail cast on. So if you had your slip knot, you would just want to make sure you have enough tail to the left side of your slip knot to make to make 7 more stitches basically. So instead of making a slip knot here where I have to contend with a knot for the rest of the project because it's there and I can't undo the knot, I actually start with my hand just in, I make my long tail cast on using this slingshot position where you've got your tail coming over your thumb, around over your index finger, and then into your palm, like in between your index and middle finger into your palm. I use my ring finger and pinky to cinch everything down. So I start, rather than starting with the slip knot, I just make that first stitch by bringing the top of my needle, bring my needle over the top of that setup, go down into, so imagine this is like your start position. Okay, so start from the start position and then swing your needle tip down into your hand and away from you, and then up over to the start position again. And so that's going to put one stitch on the needle that you can just cinch down and hold while you make the rest of your stitches. Okay, so under the thumb yarn, over the finger yarn, cinch it. Don't cinch these too tight. Okay, leave them a little bit loose. Under the thumb, over the finger, bring it through and cinch it. And you just want to get your 8 stitches on the needle. All right, so again, if you're doing DPNs, once you have your 8 stitches on there, just slide them to the right and transfer tip to tip 4 stitches to another needle, and then just bring it around. With DPN or with magic loop, I slide everything onto the cable. I do grab a locking stitch marker, just a plastic locking stitch marker, and I put it on the cable between, so I have 4 stitches on either side of that. And I've had too many instances where I've accidentally put a little kink in my cable. So this just allows me to grab onto the stitches with my left hand and the cable, like pull on the cable with the stitch marker without pulling too much of a bend into the cable. So depending on what kind of cables you have, like the ChiaGoo red lace cables, you're not going to kink those. So you could just pinch them together and grab the 4 stitches. But I just find it easier to do it that way. It's just kind of a safeguard to keep from damaging my cables. So once you have your 4 stitches and 4 stitches, again, this is going to work whether you are on magic loop or whether you're on double pointed needles. You want to make sure that your stitches are all in a line. Okay, so when you bring your needles together, the bottoms of your stitches should curve in like a U shape from one needle to the other. You don't want a situation where they end up twisted around at all. Okay, you want to make sure that they're straight, that you slit them on there. If you introduce a curve, you're going to end up with a Mobius. So before you start, so to get started, you're going to want to make sure your working yarn is coming from the last stitch on your back needle. It should be coming underneath the needle and then over the top and through the stitch towards you. And then I just like to kind of tuck my tail over here to the left, tuck my working yarn over here to the right, and I just kind of like to pinch the stitches on the needle together so the needles are right next to each other before I get started, and then I can use the tail and the working yarn to just kind of tug down underneath to hold all that in place. So this is how you would have your setup, how it should look when you do the long tail cast on, whether you're using double pointed needles or magic loop. For Judy's improved magic cast on, I am actually going to not only do the cast on, but I'm actually going to do the first round. And the reason for that is that Judy's improved magic cast on is a really unstable cast on. So you can't just cast on the stitches and then walk away and come back and expect them to be there, because there's nothing securing the stitches. So to do this cast on, it kind of works the same whether you're using magic loop or double pointed needles. You need both of your needles in your right hand being held parallel. You want your yarn in your left hand. You want your tail of your working yarn coming over your thumb, and then from that over your finger, and then down over your index finger, and then down in between your index and middle finger into your palm. And then you can just kind of grasp everything in your palm with your ring finger and pinky to hold some tension there. So it is similar to it's the slingshot setup, like you're going to do a long tail cast on. It's basically that same setup. If you are not comfortable starting the way I'm going to start, which is I'm actually just going to put the first stitch on the needles without doing any kind of slip knot. If you start with a slip knot, do not count that slip knot as a stitch. Okay. That's not your first stitch. Your first stitch is actually going to go on the opposite needle. So you're going to have to basically add a stitch after where I would finish. So I'll show you with my needle that's closer to me. I'm going to come down. I'm going to bring my needle down into, let's call this the start position. Okay. So I'm going to come down in the start position with just that one needle. And I'm going to rotate that needle down into my hand and away from me, and then swing it up and back to that start position. And then I'm going to put this other needle next to it. Okay. So that's going to put one stitch on my needle that's closer to me, my front needle. And then I'm just going to work the following sequence to get a stitch on my back needle. So this is the sequence to add one stitch, and then I'm going to do the full sequence. Okay, so I'm going to put a stitch on my back needle by swinging both needles toward me over that yarn that's coming over my thumb, and I'm just going to let that come in between my needles and over that back needle, and then come back to the start position. Okay, so the full sequence is we're going to swing both needles away from us, over the yarn that's going over the index finger, and then scoop under with your front needle and come back to start. Swing your needles towards you and let that yarn that's over your thumb go in between the needles and over your back needle and come back to start. So now I have 2 stitches on both needles. Again, I'm going to swing both needles away from me and over the yarn that's going over my index finger, and then scoop under that with my front needle and come back to start, and then swing back toward me. Bring the yarn that's going over my thumb between the needles and over the back needle and come back to start. Do that one more time. Swing both needles over the yarn going over my index finger and scoop under it with my front needle. Bring both needles toward me, over that yarn, and then let that come between. The yarn over my thumb needs to come between those needles and over the back needle, and come back to start. You should have 4 stitches on both needles. At this point, you want to twist your hand, twist your left hand so that those yarns back there are twisted. And then I kind of grab with my index finger down here and kind of hold everything in place. Because to get started, we actually need to flip everything around. Okay, so I'm going to bring everything around. I want my working yarn to be coming from the last stitch on this. Sorry, I want to make sure I have that right. Yeah, so I want my working yarn to be coming from this last stitch on this back needle. And I want my tail, I'm going to just use that tail to kind of cinch that in place. So I'm going to bring the working yarn in between the needles over here to the right, and I'm going to bring my tail over here in between the needles to the left. So this is going to work whether you're on DPNs or magic loop. Okay, you won't have a cable to get in the way. So from here, I'm just going to kind of rotate my needles a little bit so everything's coming toward itself. I want to work into these stitches on the front to start. And so it's going to depend, if you're using magic loop, you're going to want to pinch everything in the back very tightly before you start, and then pull that back needle out to begin. Okay, so if you were using DPNs, you just use your third needle to work into these front stitches. I'm going to kind of push that front needle out a little bit, and then I'm going to grab my working yarn, make sure it's cinched right here, and then I'm going to pull my needle out. So if you were working this with DPNs, you'd obviously just be doing this with the third needle. And you want to work these stitches really, really close. Do not introduce any extra slack right now. So just kind of poke the tip of your needle in to that first stitch, yarn over, pull it through, and then get it up on the shaft, and then just slide that stitch that you just worked into off the needle. Get into that next stitch, yarn over, pull that through, work that all the way up onto the shaft, and then slide that off. At this point, you can kind of release everything. Okay, your stitches are secure now, so then you're just going to continue knitting around. So this is actually round 1. Okay, when you get to that stitch that you put on the needle, this is the first stitch, so it's going to be the 4th stitch on that front needle. This is the twisted stitch that we made to start putting those stitches on there. Don't knit into it as usual. Knit through the back loop. Okay, it's currently, if you worked into it like a regular knit stitch, you'd twist it a little bit more than it needs to be. If you work it into the back loop, it's going to lay like a regular stitch. Okay, so you can just work those stitches on the front, and then again, if you're on DPNs, you're just switching to the next DPN. But on magic loop, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange things. So my tail is again coming to my left, my working yarn is coming to my right, and I'm going to pull both between the needles, and I'm just going to pull that fabric down that I just created before I get started. So push my front needle close to the tip, cinch everything back here on the back needle, and then work these next 4 stitches. So I'm again going to work 2 stitches kind of close. So poke it in, bring it up on the shaft, but I don't want to pull extra slack out of that stitch. Okay, especially if you're working onto magic loop, you're going to pull too much slack from the stitch that's on the cable, and you don't want to do that. So once you got 2 stitches on there, everything should be good to go. Just knit the next 2. And that is finishing round 1 after putting your stitches on using Judy's Improved Magic Cast On. So at this point you should have, it's going to look like for the first row, it's just going to look like a line of stockinette on one side and a line of purl stitches on the other side. Okay. Once you start adding stitches, it's going to create that round, but it is going to have that center that the pinwheel kind of comes into the stitches and then crosses over to its opposite. So that is how you get started if you are using Judy's Improved Magic Cast On. Before I work any of the actual project, I did want to offer several tips for those who are having problems with ladders. So you might be new to working this particular kind of project, especially when you start with a itty bitty little circle and you're gradually working out, as opposed to something like working a neck hole on a sweater, or socks where you start with a larger diameter anyway. You might just be newer to knitting in general. Whatever the case, I did have a few things that I just wanted to suggest up front that will help prevent ladders from forming as you're working. And so some of them are universal, whether you're working on magic loop or you're working with double pointed needles, it's going to apply equally. Some of them are just specific to one or the other. So I'm going to start with kind of the overall, what works for both of them, or what you need to keep in mind for both of them. So to start, every time you are ready to transition to working on the next needle, whether you're working with double pointed needles or you're working with magic loop, you do want the working yarn coming from the working yarn that's attached to the last stitch you made should be on your back needle, the needle that's further away from you, and it should be forming that stitch by going underneath the needle and then up around the side that's further away from you, and then coming over the top of that needle towards you. And when you confirm that, yes, that's where my yarn is coming from, you're going to want to tuck it in between your needles to get started. You're just going to want to tug it down. Okay, so same thing, double pointed needles, you want your working yarn to be coming from that last stitch on the back needle, and it needs to be coming through that stitch, making that stitch by going underneath the needle, coming over the back, and then around the top towards you. And then you want to bring that down in between the needles to get started. So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is with both magic loop and double pointed needles, each time you finish a set, you're going to want to take your fabric, you're just going to kind of grasp the fabric that you're making down underneath the needles and just give it a little tug. Okay, what you want to do is you want to make sure that your purl stitches, so you can kind of pull the needles apart, and you should be able to see the purl ridge down in between the needles. You want to tug your fabric so that those purls are sitting on the bottom edge of your needle. So if you think about if you were looking at a needle straight on, if the top of the needle is the 12 o'clock position, the bottom of the needle is the 6 o'clock position, you probably want your purl stitches to be sitting at the between 6:30 and 7 o'clock position, very low on that bottom edge of the needle, once you tug your fabric down. So if you go to do that, if you go to tug it down and your purl stitches are still sitting kind of high on the needle, or you can't get that fabric to pull down in between, especially the fabric on the left side. So if your working yarn's on the right, if the fabric on the left side is not tugging down and the purl stitch on this front needle and the purl stitch on this back needle are up against each other like this, that's a really good indicator that you pulled too much slack when you started the previous set, so the half round before. So you want to be able to tug your fabric down and have those purl stitches sitting down pretty low across the bottom edge of the needle. And it's a good way to figure out very quickly that you have a problem, as opposed to getting 10 rounds down the road and going, wait, I've got this huge ladder on one side of I've got two huge ladders. If you've done this each time, it's just a way to ensure that that previous set of stitches that you just worked across that needle, you did it correctly. You did the transition from the old needle to the new needle correctly, and you didn't have too little slack in there. One of the things that I would recommend doing before you transition to the next needle, when you got everything up on your needles, and I'm going to explain in a minute why you have everything up on your needles on magic loop. If your needles are doing this, all right, if the one of the needles is being pulled under the other needle on the left side when your working yarn's on the right, that's also another indicator that you have too little slack between the stitch that's on this needle and the stitch that's on this needle. And all you have to do is just tink back that half set of, half round of stitches and get everything back up on the needles, because you shouldn't continue once you have it like this. As long as it's like this, then continue. If you have a problem, if you have it's pulling together or you can't get your purl stitches to come down in between the needles, just tink back half a set and do it over again. If every time you get ready to start, you've got everything in the right place and the purl stitches are coming down here and the needles are sitting nice and parallel, great. You shouldn't have any slack there. Now, you can check for too much slack. So when you finish working across a set of stitches, you should be able to pull the front, the part where your working yarn is, you should be able to pull that a little bit further apart than the back. So if you kind of hold the needles parallel, you should be able to pull more here than you can here. It should be a little bit tighter back here than it is up here. All right, same thing here. So if you finish a set and you've got a big wide gap back here, I'm forcing it, but you have a big wide gap back here that is actually wider than the gap right here, that is an indicator that you have too much slack back here. And again, all you have to do is just tink back across. So tink is unknit across the stitches that you just worked and go back to when it was correct. So if you're doing this for each transition, you're never going to get too far before you realize you've either got too much slack or too little slack. Okay? My next recommendation is to create for yourself an imaginary box. Basically just a space. And work the first 2 to 3 stitches of each time you transition to a new needle. Work the first 2 to 3 stitches in that box. So I'm going to demonstrate here. So actually I'm going to start with my DPNs, because once I do this and explain why, then we will be done with DPNs. So when you're going to work the next few stitches, all right, so you obviously want these stitches on your back needle to be up on the shaft of the needle. You don't want them anywhere near the tips because that's going to allow you to tighten them too much. But when you're working these first few stitches, rather than holding your needles, so normally when I'm working let's see, for instance, if I were just going to be continuing to work from this needle right here, just working across whatever, you can see my needles kind of form this X. They're basically creating a 90-degree angle right here. Okay. I don't want to do that when I'm working from this needle to this needle for the first 2 or 3 stitches, because it's going to introduce slack into my system that I don't want. So I'm going to pretend like I'm having to hold everything in just a very small space, which means I need to make small movements and I need to make the stitches just the size that I need them. So when I do this, what I do is I poke the tip of my needle into the stitch, and then I wrap it and I pull it through. But I'm doing the best I can to just create the exact same size stitch I need without any extra slack. So rather than like pulling the needle up and then pulling the slack back out, I'm literally just poking the tip of my needle in, wrapping it, and then as I pull that through, I'm just pushing that up onto the shaft of the needle and then using my hand to move that stitch that I just worked into off. So I'm working this tiny little space to create these first couple of stitches. So I'll slip my stitch marker here. Well, I'll drop my stitch marker. I'll come back and get it. But again, go into this next stitch, just kind of poke the tip in, wrap it, get that new stitch all the way up onto the shaft, and then just slide that stitch off. Once I have 2 stitches on here, I can go ahead and just tug, give it a little tug to make sure there's no extra slack. But what I don't want to do is tug it tight up against that back needle, like to the point that I'm pulling this fabric around, because that is going to make it too tight and it will create a ladder. All right, so I just want to work those first couple of stitches in that snug little space. Then I can transition to working like I usually work. I can just let everything sit how it would sit and work how I'd work. Okay, it's just those first couple of stitches that you want to work close so that you're not introducing any extra slack and you're not having to tug out any slack that might get tugged too much. Okay, so it's just a way to ensure that those first couple of stitches are the right size as you're making them and that you're not having to manipulate the working yarn to either tighten or loosen those stitches after you've made them. So that's kind of it for the double pointed needle part of the how to prevent ladders demonstration, I guess. So the only other thing I want to say before you run away, if you're using double pointed needles, is even if you don't feel like you need the full tutorial, go watch how I do round 3 on the double pointed needles, because I'm going to explain why I have stitch markers and a beginning of round marker on there, which will also help you with preventing ladders. So go watch my round 3. All right, so if you are working on magic loop, you want to do the same thing, but I wanted to start by saying there's a reason that I have all my stitches up on my needles to start each set or each half round. Now, I know that in Shandy's tutorial, she actually suggests that after you finish working a set of stitches, so let's say I just finished working, let's see, if I just finished working this stitch, like that's my last stitch, she suggests that you can pull those stitches down onto the cable before you put the stitches that you need to work next back up onto the needle, which you can. However, if you're struggling with ladders, I really, really want to recommend not doing that. As you get more comfortable working this kind of thing, you can do that. You will get to the point where you understand your tension enough to not have to pull everything back up onto the needle each time. But for those who are struggling with ladders, I really, really want to recommend each time you finish a set, get everything back up onto the needles. That'll give you a chance to make sure that you can tug your fabric down so that your purl stitches are sitting down at the bottom edge of that shaft, that you have enough slack back here, that it's not so tight that it's pulling your needles underneath each other, one of the needles underneath the other one. It's just going to give you a chance to make sure that you didn't pull too much tension into the stitch when you started the last time. And one of the really good ways to figure that out is trying to get your stitches back up onto the needle. So I'm actually going to demonstrate what's going to happen if you pull too much slack. So normally when I'm working on a magic loop, what I do is once I have everything up on my needles, I actually put tension on the stitch that's on the back, so the stitch where the working yarn's coming from. So you can even try it, just like pull a little bit of slack into that stitch and then stick your finger on it and then pull on that stitch. You should be able to feel the stitch move underneath your finger. And what that's going to do is it's going to give you some tactile feedback once you pull those stitches down onto the cable. So depending on whether you're a continental knitter or an English knitter, if you hold your yarn in your left hand, you may have to put a different finger on that stitch to tension it. Just kind of depends on how you hold your yarn. But basically what you want to do is you want to hold the tension on that stitch. Once you get everything's up on the needles, you've tugged everything down, you've tightened that last stitch, just hold some tension however you can, whichever finger works for you. Hold some tension as you pull the needle out, okay? So as you pull the needle out, you're kind of holding that stitch up against the cable. And as you work these first couple of stitches, again, I'm going to recommend work them nice and close inside this little box this little imaginary space that you've created. But you don't want any slack in this yarn coming from that stitch, all right? So you already have that stitch tightened. So when you make this first couple of stitches, you want to do the same. You want to, poke the tip in, wrap that stitch, just introduce enough slack to get that stitch up onto the needle shaft, and then just slide that stitch off very carefully and closely. Slip your stitch marker if you have it. Do the same thing with the next stitch. Just work it in a very small space, creating exactly the size stitch that you need and nothing more. And then if you need to tighten anything, you want to wait until you have that second stitch on there and then just give it a little tug. At this point, you're going to want a little bit more slack in the system than less. So if I didn't do that, if after working that first stitch, I tighten my yarn, what it's going to do is it's actually going to tighten the stitch that's back on the cable. And it might be enough to tighten not only that stitch, but the stitch next to it. So if I did that, if I introduced, you know, pulled out too much slack here and made this stitch that I just made too close to that stitch on that back cable, then I can knit across the rest of this. I can go ahead and make the rest of these stitches. But what's going to happen is when I get to this end, when I want to pull these stitches back up onto the needle before I start the next round or next half round, what I'm going to find is I can't, or it's very difficult. So let me get over here. So at this point, I would want to turn and then push these stitches right here back onto my needle. All right, so far so good, so far so good. And then I get down here and the stitches, these last 2.5 stitches are going to be almost impossible to get back onto my needle. So I'm going to have to like do this little twisty thing, push, twist, really force them onto that needle. Now, if I had just left those on the cable before pulling my other stitches out, or pulling those other stitches onto the cable before trying to do this, then it wouldn't be hard because I would have changed where the slack is to the stitches that are on the cable. So with that stitch that's too tight, if I just leave this, I leave my needles, you can see that it's so tight, it's actually pulling this needle underneath, the front needle's being pulled underneath the back needle, back here. All right, so same thing, I get everything up here, I'll try to tug these stitches down. Those purl bumps in the back, they don't want to go down. Like, they will not want to pull in between the needles anymore. They won't want to pull down far enough. So that's a really good indicator. Hey, I did something too tight when I started that last set. And so instead of having to, you know, rip out and work back 10 rows when I find the ladder that happens because I did that, I can simply unknit the stitches that I did, this last row of stitches, or the last needle's worth of stitches that I did, and get everything back to when it was correct. So if you've never tinked before, literally just lift your yarn so you can see the opening, the hole in your stitch, stick your needle tip in there, and then just pull your yarn out. Tink is just knit spelled backwards. So you're basically unknitting each stitch. So if I come back here, oops, I drop my needle out of my last stitch. So I know that when I was finishing out the previous set, like how I had my needles positioned before I started that line of stitches that I just tinked, that everything was in the correct place. So I should be able to just, it might, because I pulled a little bit of extra slack into that stitch, I might have to work to get that first stitch back on the needle, but I'm just pulling slack now out of my working yarn to do that, instead of trying to pull slack out of a different stitch. So then once I get all my stitches back up on the needles, I can just start again and make sure that I'm not pulling too much slack into that stitch, that's the stitches that are on the cable when I work those first couple of stitches. I know it seems counterintuitive for too tight yarn to make a ladder. I promise it does. It just makes a ladder in a slightly different position than it would make if you were introducing slack into the stitches. Yeah, I think that's it for my recommendations to help prevent ladders. Again, if you are doing magic loop, I do recommend that until you're comfortable with your tension and sure that you're not creating ladders, pull everything back up onto both needles before you start the next set of stitches. Work everything in a nice close box for the first couple of stitches. If you do need to tension your stitches, your new stitches, don't do it until you have at least 2 stitches on the right needle. And you just, when you finish, you want to get everything up on the needles, and then you want to pull your fabric down and make sure that your purl stitches are coming across the very bottom of that needle shaft. One other thing, if you are on magic loop, if you're worried about ladders, one of the things you can do is at any point after you've begun working, you can take a locking stitch marker and put it on your cable, anywhere on your cable. All right, so you just want to basically, it's going to provide the division of the stitches and keep it so that you don't have to count and figure out which stitches go onto which needle. But basically, once you have a stitch marker down on your cable, like so, push all your stitches off of your needles down onto your cable. All right, push everything down onto the cable and then down so that they join together down at the end. All right, and in doing that, you can basically pull your cable into a nice big circle, get the fabric all stretched out to make sure that it looks nice and even, that you don't have any giant, obviously where your working yarn is gonna be a little wonky maybe, but you can kind of hold it all together right there. But you should be able to, it should look pretty symmetrical. You should be able to tell right away whether you have any giant ladders or not. And so that's a good way to, especially if you're working magic loop, to just kind of keep you on track and make sure before you get too far down the road. It's really frustrating. I find it's really frustrating to just get, let's say, 15 or 20 rounds into a pattern before you realize that you have a mistake and have to either start way over or back out most of the way or something like that. So once you have, you could do this as early as like round 5 or 6, where you can start to see it's not going to be quite as easy to see just because those yarn overs at the very beginning are really close to each other. So you're just not going to see the pattern emerging quite as well until you get further along, closer to row 6 or row 8. And then just once you're done, once you're sure you like what you have, you're not going to rip it out, just grab your stitch marker in one hand and then just kind of pull with your left, your thumb and forefinger on your other hand to pull those stitches back up onto the needles. And then you can just continue on from where you were unless you need to go back and fix something. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind if you're working on magic loop. Now, if you're working on double pointed needles, you're obviously going to have to have enough stitches to be on 4 needles, and then you can kind of spread your stitches out and then spread the needles apart to get a little glimpse of what it's supposed to look like. With that out of the way, let's work some actual pattern. If you're working with double pointed needles, you can follow along with me here. I would recommend, if you want to work along with me, when we get to round 3, I'm going to be adding a beginning of round marker. This is linked in the video description below. It is, I don't work for the company or anything. I don't get any kind of financial incentive for telling you about it. I just know that until I found this, I really struggled to figure out which row I was on or which round I was on when I was trying to keep track of things. And I'd have to stop and like move sticky notes or write things down or forget to write things down and then have to rip stuff out. And so it's really been beneficial to my knitting. I find it's very, very helpful to have these. And so I will be adding this as a beginning of round marker starting on round 3. And I will also be using stitch markers, which, if anybody wants to know, they're just open jump rings that I got off of Amazon, specifically because it's a jewelry making thing. And when I try to get them from like Walmart or Hobby Lobby or Michael's, they tend to come actually opened. Whereas the ones that I've gotten from Amazon, specifically the ones that I linked below that are not, it's not an affiliate link or anything. I'm not getting any kind of kickback for sending you there. I just want you to know what I'm using in case you want to use it. That's the link. But anyway, the ones that I get from Amazon tend to come. So there's been a couple that I found that are open, but they're so cheap. It's like, I don't even have to worry about it. Most of them come nearly closed, like nearly all the way closed. The opening is so tiny that I don't really ever have to worry about yarn getting snagged in it or anything like that. And so I like them because I can get the size that's the kit I got came with like 8 different sizes. And so I can slide you can pick the size that's just slightly bigger than your needle and they slide really easily. But they're small enough and light enough that they stay out of the way. I have some nicer stitch markers that I really like working with, but when I'm putting a lot of stitch markers on, especially for something like this where you're working on double pointed needles, It's just you have to move so many things, and it's so close that you're having to work. Big dangly stitch markers just get in the way, and so that's why I like to use these for this kind of a project. So just know you're going to want, if you want to follow along with me and do the steps that I'm recommending on round 3, you're going to want a total of 8 stitch markers, or 1 beginning of round marker and 7 stitch markers. Okay, so getting started with double pointed needles. My cast on that I've used for this is just a pinhole cast on using a crochet hook. When you get started, you do want to find the, if the cast on you're using has a purl side, which pretty much it's a little harder to see on like a long tail cast on, but if you used a pinhole cast on, you should be able to see the purl side. Anyway, you want to make sure that your working yarn is coming from the last stitch on the back needle, the last stitch to the right on the back needle, and that your purls are kind of facing up. And then you want to poke them down in between the needles, so you can bring your needles together. And I like to bring my tail to the left down between the needles, and then just kind of use my working yarn and my tail to pull everything down so that the needles are pulled together, just to get started. So to work this first round, we're just knitting around, but we do want to work these stitches up close, the first couple of stitches at least, up close to the back needle. And so I'm just going to poke the tip of my new needle in and wrap it and bring that stitch through, and then get it all the way up onto the shaft of my needle. Okay, so I want it to be snug to the stitch here, but I don't want to necessarily snug this to the back needle. If I do that, I may make it too snug and actually end up creating a ladder. So I'm just going to kind of hold the tension there, slide that stitch I worked into off, and then I'm going to go the same way into the second stitch. Just kind of poke the tip in, wrap it, bring that stitch through, and then get that all the way up onto the shaft of my needle. Assuming I have all the layers of that working yarn on that. Okay, so once I have 2 stitches on the needle, I can kind of tension around the back of the back needle to just give those stitches a tug. And then I also can change my setup into a format that's easier for me to work. So this is how it's comfortable for me to work when I'm using DPNs, is to have this back needle kind of horizontal, and then be working with the front needles kind of at an X in the front. So you're just going to continue knitting across those 4 stitches, and then turn and do the same thing with the other 4 stitches. So for these first few rounds, I do like to swing my tail back and forth just so that I can use it to help get that fabric down in between the needles. You want these purl bumps to be sitting down at the bottom edge of the needle. You don't want them way up high, and so you want to kind of rotate everything down so the needles are close together each time you get started. So same thing on this side. I'm just going to poke the tip of my needle into this first stitch, wrap it, pull that through and up onto the shaft of the needle, and then slide that stitch off. Do the same thing with this next stitch. So you can see for those first 2 stitches, both of my left needles, the needle I'm working from, and that back needle, are basically horizontal and they're parallel to each other. Okay, once I've got a couple of stitches on the needle, then I'm just going to rotate this front needle so that it's more comfortable for me to work with. But with this first row of stitches, I don't actually go all the way into any of the stitches as I'm working them. I'm just kind of poking the tip of my needle in, because those are the stitches that I made with the crochet hook, and I don't want them to get too big, and I don't want them to get too tight around my little donut down here, because if I do that, they will not, I won't be able to cinch that down quite as well. All right, so I don't want those stitches to get too stretched out. So once you've worked all 8 stitches, round 2 is going to be the tricky round. All right, so I'm going to again bring my tail across here to the left, down in between the needles, and I'm going to rotate that so that all that fabric is coming down underneath. So as you're as you're creating stitches, you are going to have a little something down here that you can actually grab and tug to help rotate all the stitches down so that those purl bumps are down near the bottom of the needles instead of up in between them. All right. So the reason that round 2 is complicated is because we start with a yarn over. And yes, it looks like all the rest of the rounds that are even numbered do start with a yarn over, but if you follow me on round 3, there won't be, okay? So if you knit continental style, that is, if you hold your yarn in your left hand, go watch Shandy's video, which is linked in the video description below. Scroll all the way down to the bottom. The link is down there for the official Expression Fiber Arts Clue 1 video. Go watch that, because if you knit continental, she's going to do a better job of showing you how to work that first yarn over before you knit the first stitch than I can show you, because I hold my yarn in my right hand. I'm an English knitter, and so I'm gonna be doing this first yarn over a little bit differently than you would be doing if you were holding your yarn in your left hand. So I'm gonna move my needles so that my front needle is pretty close to the tip. And then I'm going to bring my new needle that I'm working to up against the back needle and let that working yarn come around the front of it. So I'm just going to kind of hold that up against the shaft. So I do want this yarn over that I'm creating by doing this to be up against the shaft of the needle and not up here on the tip. It's going to make it too small. So I want to have it cinched all the way down here on the shaft before I make this first stitch. So again, I'm just going to go into that stitch, not necessarily with the whole needle. Wrap it. Then I'm going to come, so as I'm wrapping it, I'm actually holding tension on it with my left thumb. Okay, so that yarn over, when I come up here to wrap with my right hand, I'm actually holding the tension on that yarn over with my left thumb. So I wrap the needle, then I come back down here with my right thumb, hold on to that yarn over and bring that stitch through, and then up onto the shaft of the needle. So I do like to have 2 actual knit stitches on the needle before I do any snugging of my yarn, because if I try to snug this stitch, it's not only going to tighten that yarn over, but it's going to tighten that yarn over up against that back needle. So I'm going to make another yarn over, and I'm going to make this next knit stitch, get everything up onto the shaft, and then I'm just going to do a little tug. So don't worry too much about the tension in this round. If it's a little bit off as you snug everything down onto the needles when they're horizontal and parallel to each other, it should even everything out pretty well. So you shouldn't have to worry too much about a ladder just from this round. Ladders typically happen when you have multiple rounds where you're adding slack somewhere or removing too much slack somewhere. Okay, so from here, I'm just going to do yarn over knit 2 more times. So yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 1. And then to finish out round 2, I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to get my needles nice and parallel here, snug that fabric down underneath, bring my working yarn down here, and then bring my tail over here to the left. So make sure the needles are nice and together. And then again, I'm going to bring the tip of my needle that I'm working to underneath the working yarn and up against that back needle. And then I'm going to use my thumb to cinch this yarn up against the shaft of my right needle. Then I'm going to go into this first stitch. And you can see I'm holding the tension on that yarn over that I made with my thumb. Yarn over, and then grab that tension again with my right thumb, bring that through and up onto the shaft, push that stitch off the needle, yarn over into that next stitch, and I'm just switching where I'm holding the tension on those yarn overs from my right thumb to my left thumb when I go to wrap the yarn. Okay, once I have those, I have yarn over knit, yarn over knit. Once I have those on my right needle, I can pull to make sure they're snug, and then I can just finish this out. Yarn over, knit 1. Oops. Try that again. Yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 1. All right. So that's the end of round 2. You should have 8 stitches on both needles, or on each needle. And let's see, I'm going to bring my tail back over here to the left. Tug that fabric down underneath. Now for round 3, this is where I'm going to do several things to make it easier to work subsequent even numbered rounds. So in the even numbered rounds, it starts with a yarn over. And to avoid doing a yarn over at the beginning of a needle transition, I'm actually going to move my beginning of round from here. I'm gonna stop my beginning of round being at the first stitch on the needle by bringing this last stitch of the round off of this needle and around to the front needle, and the 8th stitch of the round off of this front needle around to the back needle. So the way I want to do that is I want to make sure that my working yarn is coming over my front needle before I move this back stitch. I'm just going to slide everything down pretty close to the end here. And I can actually tug a little bit of slack into that. I'm just going to pinch it back here, and I'm going to rotate it around. So I'm going to bring it off the tip of the needle and then around the tip. So that is what would, if you were moving it just tip to tip, that's what that would look like. It's just because my tips are facing the same direction, I have to bring it around. Okay. So then slide everything back on, bring down the tension. Now remember, we've already worked this stitch. That means when I start on this first needle, I actually need to slip what is the last stitch of round 2. So I'm going to even out my stitches because now I have 9 on the front and 7 on the back needle. So I'm going to bring all my stitches over here to the left, and I'm going to do the same thing with this last stitch on my front needle. I'm just going to pinch it back here, and because I don't have a way to introduce slack, get your tail out of your way so you don't get that in by, but just kind of pinch that stitch, bring it off and around. So if you're not comfortable pinching because you don't have any slack, you can use like I was going to say another double pointed needle, but mine are kind of blunt. So you could use like a tapestry needle where you basically want to come into the stitch from right to left. Just make sure you actually get into the hole and not through the stitch. Don't go through the stitch, and bring it off so that it's you're basically taking it off the tip this way and then bringing it around and putting it on the tip that way. Okay. But however you do it, just if you transition those around, you'll still have 8 stitches on each needle, and you will never have to do a yarn over at the beginning of a needle from this point forward. So that's kind of the first thing I do at the beginning of round 3, bring my tail back down. And then I do want to bring my working yarn down in between my needles. It's just for this needle's worth only, my working yarn is going to be coming off of that front needle, like around from underneath toward me, up the front of the needle, and then away from me into the center. And it's going to come down between the needles. But I'm just slipping that first stitch because it's already been worked. That's the last stitch of round 2. And then as I work, I'm going to be putting stitch markers on. So round 3 is just a knit round. So I'm going to, again, slip this first stitch. It may feel a little, maybe a little bit difficult to do that without introducing a little bit of slack. So you just want to gently tighten it to that back needle. Do not cinch it down too much, or you'll introduce slack, or you'll remove slack that needs to be there. So slip that first stitch purlwise, tip to tip, and then I'm going to put my stitch marker on, my beginning of round marker, saying I'm at round 3, and then I'm going to knit 2. 1, 2, and here is where you can snug up your tension if you need to. And then from here on out, I'm just going to be working place a stitch marker, knit 2. 1, 2. Place a stitch marker, knit 2. 1, 2. Place a stitch marker, knit 2. So you knit this one. Yes, this stitch is going to feel really, really loose. That's your yarn over from the previous round. It's going to feel very, very large. Don't worry about it. Okay. It's not a problem. I promise, don't worry about it. Okay. It will tame itself. So place the stitch marker and knit that one, and then we're going to come around to the other needle. Oops, we're going to drag our yarn ball into the frame because it's sticky. All right, so come around to this other needle. And so we did the place the stitch marker and knit one, so we need to knit this second stitch, right? So knit two. Again, I'm going to work these first couple of stitches nice and close to my back needle and just try to work the stitches close without introducing any extra slack. So two. Once I have two stitches on the needle, on my right needle, I can snug if I want to. So I place my stitch marker, knit one, and then the second stitch. And then I'm going to place my stitch marker, knit two, one, two, place my stitch marker, knit two, one, two, place my stitch marker, whoops, drop my stitch marker, and then knit one, and again, this is a yarn over, so it's going to feel big, don't worry about it, knit one, and then the last stitch of the round is now going to be on this next needle. So I'm going to, so I got my tail caught in there, hang on. Oh, so the first thing I'm going to do now that I have my nice little pouch is I'm actually going to wind up my tail, just make a little center pull thing around my pinky, and then I'm just going to tuck it into that pouch, and that's going to give me a little bit of, it's going to give that pouch a little bit of thickness, so when I pinch it, it's a little easier to grab. And then to finish out round three, I just need to work this first stitch on my front needle. So I'm going to be working the end of round three and then the beginning of round four on this front needle. So I start by just knitting this last stitch, and then round four, oh, other way. Try it again. Sometimes I have to move this manually when I'm doing these first few rounds, just because it's so close. All right, so round four, we start with a yarn over. So we do the yarn over, but we've already got a stitch on the needle, so it's a little easier to figure out how to make a yarn over from that, because we're just doing a knit to knit, knit stitch to knit stitch yarn over. So yarn over and then knit two. So after I knit this first stitch, I can tug my tension a little bit to make sure everything's snug back there. Knit two, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, knit two, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, knit two. Did I do my yarn over? Yes, my yarn over landed. So this will happen sometimes. Sometimes your yarn over will end up on the opposite side of your stitch marker. So slip your stitch marker, yarn over, knit two. Slip your stitch marker, yarn over, and then we're going to knit one here, and then our second stitch is going to be again on the next needle. So continuing, I did my yarn over, I did knit one, so then I knit the second stitch here, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, knit two, one, two, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, knit two. So I'm going to come back, make sure my yarn over comes to the left of my stitch marker. One, two, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, knit two, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, and then knit this one. And again, my next stitch is going to be on my front needle now. So that'll be the last stitch of round 4 will be on the front needle. So as I'm working this next round, so I'm going to finish out round 4, and then I'm going to introduce 2 more needles. I'm going to basically move from a 2 needle setup to a 4 needle setup. Once you're in a 4 needle setup, you have a lot less, it's a lot less problematic to do the tension from one needle to the next, okay? Which is why I moved to the 4 needle setup so quickly. You can wait until your needles are just about full and then introduce another needle, like move to 3 needles. The only thing I want to make sure I do is I want to start a new needle 1 stitch before a stitch marker. So I'm basically going to be putting half of the stitches on the front needle on a second needle. So I'll knit half of them and then transition to another needle. And then the same thing on the back. I'm going to knit half of these and then transition to another one. So I'm going to work this last stitch of round 4. And then round 5 is just you're knitting all the way around, because round 5 is a odd numbered round and you just knit. So I'm going to knit, I'm going to slip my stitch marker, knit 3, slip my stitch marker, knit 2, and then move to another needle. Okay. So like I said, you're welcome to wait until later if you prefer. I just like, I find it easier to tension when I have all 4 needles to work on. So I'm going to work this last stitch of round 4, which is just a knit stitch. Slip my stitch marker. And then I'm going to knit. So to each marker, there should be 3 stitches. 1, 2, whoops, 2, 3. Slip my stitch marker. And then I'm going to knit 2 here, 2, and then that 3rd stitch is actually going to go on another needle. So what I do want to do is I want to make sure that the 2 needles, the one that I'm working from and the one that I'm working to, are fairly close to each other when I work these first couple of stitches. So I kind of want to work that in a close area. All right, but then I just want to make sure that my previous stitch is on the shaft and my new stitch is on the shaft. And I don't really have to worry, as long as I'm not making them too loose, I really don't need to worry about tightening them. So 2, 3, slip my stitch marker, 1, 2, and then I will transition to the next needle. All right, so I should have 6 stitches on my first needle, 6 stitches on my second needle. I'm going to have 6 stitches on my next needle. So again, I'm going to bring these 2 needles, the one I'm working from and the one I'm working to, kind of, they're not totally parallel. You can see that this needle's pointing, the right needle's kind of straight up, the left needle's pointing a little bit to the right. But I'm just going to stick my 3rd needle here in between, wrap it, make that first stitch up on the shaft of the needle, and just keep it close to the needle on the right. So slip my stitch marker, 1, 2, 3, slip my stitch marker, 1, 2. All right, so now I've got 6 stitches on this needle and I need to introduce my 4th needle. So again, I'm working all of this kind of close, right? Get the tips of those needles close, knit that first stitch, slip my stitch marker, 1, 2, 3, slip my stitch marker, 1, 2, and then that last stitch of round 5 is going to be on my next needle. So from this point, I can almost, it's almost like working in the round. So I'm going to just work a couple more rounds just to show you what I do at each needle transition. And for me, it's really just a matter of getting the needles in the in close proximity as you start. So just the first couple of stitches, you want the tip of this to be kind of near the tip of that. But then once you work a couple of stitches, you can spread things out as you prefer. So again, to finish up this round, I do need to knit this last stitch of round 5. So I'm just going to poke my needle in there, nice and close. And what I like to do is actually tension the needle I'm working to the needle that it's behind. So I just kind of pull it so that it's close up next to that. So I'm going to slip my beginning of round marker. Now for round 6, we're just going to be doing knit or yarn over and then knit 3. But you'll notice if you did your previous round correctly by counting and making sure you had 3 stitches between each of the markers, round 6 and all the subsequent even numbered rounds are going to be yarn over, knit to the marker. All right. So when I do my yarn over here, I actually bring the yarn over and then I bring it back behind, like I bring my working yarn around the back of this needle that I'm was just working on. All right. And so what that does is it helps keep the tension on that yarn over when I go into this stitch. So yarn over, and then I'm going to knit 3, which is also knitting to the next marker. 2, 3, slip my stitch marker. Sorry, needed some more slack. Yarn over, and then knit 3 or knit to the marker. 1, 2, and obviously my third stitch is going to be on the next needle. Just going to rearrange all these. I'm going to bring the tips of those up close to each other before I start. Poke that in there. There's my third stitch. And then again, I'm just kind of tensioning it by holding that needle up against the needle that I just came from. Yarn over, knit 3, 1, 2, 3, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, 1, 2, third stitch is going to be on the next needle. So again, the 2 needles, the needle I'm working from and the needle I'm working to are what I want to bring close to each other. So there's 3, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, 1, 2, 3, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, 1, 2, third stitch is going to be on the next needle. So I bring these 2 close to each other, stick my needle in between there, 3, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, 1, 2. So once I have 3 or 4 stitches on there, I actually like to bring the needle I'm working on behind the previous needle. It's just more comfortable for me. 3, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, 1, 2, and then my last stitch of the round is going to be on my next needle. So I will bring everything around, get those 2 needles up nice and close to each other, and then work this last stitch, 3. And then slip my beginning of round marker. So round 7, you're just knitting around. So from this point forward, if you look at the pattern, every odd numbered round, yarn round 7, round 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, all the way to the end, is just knit all the way around. If you look at the round after, so all the way up through round 16, basically, look at the number after K in the even number following the odd numbered round that you're on. So like for round 7, where I knit around, in round 8 it says knit yarn over and then knit 4. So the knit 4, that's telling me how many stitches I should have right now when I work round 7, how many stitches should be between each of my stitch markers. And so checking this as you work each round, either before you start, so you can actually, before you start the round, you can look and make sure you have 4 stitches between each of the markers. It's a good way to keep you on track and make sure you're not missing stitches or adding stitches. And that way you don't get 10 rounds down the road before you realize you had a mistake way back here. So if you either count as you're working 4 stitches between each of the markers, or count before you start to make sure you have 4 stitches between the markers, it's just a good way to check and make sure. The other thing you can do is, once you have put the markers on round 3, you can look and see, like, so right in round 3, you're going to have 2 stitches between each of the markers. So from round 3, you could go through your pattern and actually put in, especially if you're using a paper pattern like you printed it out, every odd numbered round is going to increase the number of stitches between the markers by 1. So for round 3, there's 2 stitches between each of the markers. In round 5, there's 3 stitches between the markers. In round 7, there's 4. In round 9, there's 5. In round 11, there's 6, and so on and so forth. And so this is all the way to the end of the pattern until you get to round 36, because you don't add stitches in round 36. But every odd number round from this point is 1 stitch between the markers more than the previous round. And so you can just pencil that into your pattern and be able to, at a glance, make sure that your previous round is correct before you even get started. So again, so round 7, we're just knitting around, and I'm going to have 4 stitches between each of my markers. And just remember that the last stitch of every other set is going to be on the next needle. So at each transition, I just want to bring the tips kind of close to each other, and then get my needle in there, work that first stitch up against the back needle. All right, so I have one more stitch that I need to work to finish out this round. You can, at this point, probably get a pretty good feel just by stretching your stitches out across each of your needles as well as you can. Just be careful that you don't stretch your stitches off your needles. get a pretty good sense just by kind of pulling everything out into that square, seeing where you have your yarn overs, just making sure you're not getting any extra laddery looking spots at all. Obviously, at your needle transitions, it's going to seem a little open, but you should have, you've got your yarn over spaces coming up from each section. All right, it should look pretty even. It's going to be a little tough to tell at this point just because you're so close to the center, and those initial yarn overs are going to seem pretty big, but you shouldn't see any massive gaps between, for instance, where the knit stitches are starting to be create the bigger parts of the petals. So from here, you're basically doing the same thing all the way up through round 17. Every other row, you're either knitting all the way around, in which case the number of stitches between each of the markers is going to be the same as the number next to the K in the following even numbered round, or you're working a from the beginning of round on the even numbered rounds, you're working yarn over, knit to marker. So the number that you knit to the marker should be, like, you can look at the pattern, whatever it says, knit 4, knit 5, whatever, you can check to make sure you're on track, because when you do the yarn over knit to marker, the number that you knit should be correct according to the pattern. But it's just the same thing over and over and over again. You're either knitting all the way around, or you're working a slip the marker, yarn over, knit to the marker, slip the marker, yarn over, knit to the next marker, all the way around. So rather than working all of those rounds for you, I'm actually going to jump ahead to round 18. So from here, just remember, you're knitting all the odd numbered rows, you're just knitting all the way around, and the number of stitches between the markers should either be the number after the K in the following even numbered row, or the number of stitches in the previous even number round divided by 8. Or if you've printed out your pattern and you've written it down, you can actually have the number of stitches that you have between the markers. You can just list that, starting with round 3, where it's 2 stitches between the markers, round 5, where it's 3 stitches between the markers, round 7, where it's 4 stitches, and so on and so forth all the way through. Okay. So I'm going to jump ahead at this point to round 18. You should have, if you're on double pointed needles, it's going to kind of depend on the size of your double pointed needles. Obviously, with my thicker yarn and my bigger needles, the 5-inch needles are about running out of space. But if you are using the recommended yarn, the fingering size yarn, or light fingering as this is, especially if you're using, for instance, these are 6-inch double pointed needles, you should still have plenty of space. It's very unlikely that even with a smaller, like the 16-inch setup, it's really unlikely that you're going to be able to get all of your stitches on the needle and have enough flexibility to be able to move the stitches around the needle easily at this point. So I would really recommend waiting until you're about to round 23 to try to move them onto a full-size circular. At which point, if you have a 16-inch setup, that would be what I recommend. Starting here at round 18, you are doing, on the even numbered rounds, you are doing a sequence that is repeated. It's just a little bit of a different repeat. So you do start each even numbered round with a yarn over. So round 18, I'm going to start, do yarn over, knit 1. So this is all the even rounds. Each set starts with yarn over, knit 1. So the first time we do this for round 18, we do, after the yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, and then 1, knit 2 together. and then you're just going to knit to the marker. So the number of stitches it tells you to knit, in this case 6, should be how many stitches you have until each marker. So you're just going to repeat that sequence all the way around. Slip your stitch marker, yarn over, knit 1, and then yarn over, knit 2 together once, and then knit the 6 stitches until you get to the, should have 6 stitches to the next marker. So rather than knitting all the way around each of these rounds for you, I just want to kind of look ahead in the pattern. So from this point on, you're still knitting around each of the odd numbered rows. And so if you put in the number of stitches that you're supposed to have in each set, you can use your knit rounds to make sure that you've done the previous round correctly, or you can check the number of stitches between the stitch markers after you finish a round. You just want to make sure you don't put in too many yarn overs, not enough yarn overs, or miss a knit 2 together or something like that. But starting with round 18, when you do that sequence, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together, the next time you work it, you're going to do yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together twice. So the yarn over, knit 2 together, you're going to add a set of that. Yarn over, knit 2 together, one more set. So the next time you do it, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together twice. And then 2 rows later, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together 3 times. And each time you add a set of yarn over, knit 2 together, you're going to decrease the number of stitches that you knit after that to get to the stitch marker by 1. So from this point, I'm just going to kind of, if you want to jump over and watch me do this on the magic loop side, I do actually work through a couple of rounds like this, but just for time, I'm not gonna knit all the way around this many stitches on the DPNs. So that's kind of my recommendation. If you want to watch me do a couple of rounds, starting at round 18, you can go ahead and watch on the magic loop. And then I would recommend going ahead and switching to a 16-inch circular if you have it, starting at round 23. If you don't have it and you do have the longer circular needle, at that point you can switch to the longer circular and just jump ahead to the part in the video where I show how to move your cable, so that instead of having to get all the stitches up onto the needle each time, you're just manipulating where your cable is and just continuing to knit in the round. So with that said, if you have any questions or if there's something else you want to see, just let me know and I'll be happy to do that. To actually work clue 1, once you have your stitches cast on however you choose, just for this particular set, I'm going with the crochet pinhole cast on. You do want to make sure that your working yarn is attached to the furthest stitch to the right that's on your back needle. And I just like to bring my tail of my yarn across to the left and then bring it down in between the needles, because that gives me basically an anchor point on each side that I can pull the stitches down between the needles and pull the needles together. Okay, and so that's just going to give me a more secure start to this project. You'll watch as I work, I'm basically going to bringing my tail back and forth for the first couple of rounds, and what that's going to do is it's going to give me a little bit of leverage to just pull everything down underneath the needles. And just like when you're working further rows in and you want the purl bumps to be coming down to the bottom of the needles, you want to do that when you're getting started as well, just so you have a nice firm start to your project. If you're working with DPNs, go ahead and jump. I do have a working clue 1 with DPNs section, so go start over there. So to work round 1, you're just going to knit around, and so you just want to be careful, all the things I talked about to avoid ladders. When you pull your needle out, you want to cinch that stitch down on the back needle before you pull the needle out. which I did, and then I let go. So try that again. So you just want to get everything close together, get ready to get started, cinch that stitch down on the back needle, pull the needle out, so kind of hold that stitch up against the cable, and you want to come underneath your working yarn so that you're not accidentally trapping it and creating a yarn over on your project. And then these first couple of stitches, and I'm just going to work really close to the project. So I'm just going to stick the tip of my needle in there, wrap it with my working yarn without pulling any slack out of that stitch on the cable. Pull that up onto the shaft of my needle and slip that stitch off. Then I need to do the same thing with the next stitch. Get all that up on the shaft, slip that stitch off. And then if I need to, at this point, I can tug on my yarn just to make sure there's no extra slack in that first stitch. But I just don't want to tug on or tighten down any stitches on the cable. And then I can just complete the row or the half round by knitting the next couple of stitches. And then get everything back up on the needles. And it should glide pretty easily onto your needle. So if it's not, that's a good indicator that you might have pulled too much slack out of the stitch that was on the cable. So then again, I'm going to pull my tail over to my left and down in between the needles, maybe, and pull my working yarn to my right and in between the needles, and then just tug everything down here. And then I'm just going to cinch the back again and work the next 4 stitches, knit those. So needle comes under the working yarn, and then I'm going to work these first 2 stitches nice and close back here. Knit that one, knit that one, and then I can let go and knit these next 2. So it's not necessarily because you want to knit them tight or anything like that. It's just because you want to knit them with as little movement as possible. All right, so round 2. This is kind of, especially if you follow my suggestions for round 3, this is kind of the tricky round. If you knit continental, I will recommend, please go watch Shandy's video, specifically to see how she gets the yarn over on at the beginning of each needle, because I knit English style. I hold my yarn in my right hand, which means I'm going to be making my yarn over differently than you would be making your yarn over if you hold your yarn in your left hand. So to start round 2, I'm going to bring my tail back over here to my left and down in between the needles and wrestle with my cable that for some reason wants to continue flopping over my project. Okay, so I'm going to tug everything down here underneath. So at this point, you should have a tiny bit of fabric that you can actually grab and just kind of give it a little tug there. I'm going to cinch that back stitch up against the needle before I pull it out. And then I have to start with a yarn over. So normally, if I'm just starting with a knit stitch, I'm going to bring my needle underneath my working yarn here, come down underneath it to make that first stitch. But because I need to start with a yarn over, I'm actually going to stick my needle behind the working yarn up against that cable back there. All right, so that's going to create my first yarn over. It's just going to come around the needle here. And then I'm just going to go into this first stitch. And this is where you just want to, like, the yarn over needs to be the length of the needle. Don't pull it tight. Don't pull that stitch on the cable tight. Just wrap it around the needle, let it fall around the needle, and then wrap your stitch, pull it through, push it onto the shaft. So don't count this as being 2 stitches on the needle, because if you try to tighten things here, it can over tighten the stitch on the cable. So go ahead and make your next yarn over. Knit that next stitch. Again, do this nice and close to that cable back there. And then you can let go. Then you can tug, because that tugging that next stitch should only cinch down those yarn overs and that first stitch. It should not pull any slack from that stitch that's on the cable. And then you're just going to continue to the end of the needle. Yarn over, knit, yarn over, knit. So you should find when you get there, that last stitch on each needle might feel like it's a little bit loose, and that is what we're going for, okay? It shouldn't be super loose, but it should be a little bit looser than all the other stitches. All right, so slide everything back up onto my needle. Bring my tail across, let's see, to the left. So yeah, it's a little fiddly to get these first few rows done once you get past them, especially if your cable is just being a pill. All right. If it's not the kids or the cats, it's the cables. All right, so working yarn over here on the right, tail over here on the left, and then just grab that fabric, pinch it down underneath the needles. Sorry, maybe that'll work. If I just put another bend in you, you'll stop being so pilly. I actually switched to a longer cable, I kid you not, because my shorter one kept flopping up over the project and getting in the way. But this one does not seem to be any less. All right, so we've got our 8 stitches on the front needle, or on the back needle now. We need to get 8 stitches on this front needle, which means as we're working across, we need to be doing a yarn over before each stitch. So again, I'm going to cinch this yarn on the back needle before I pull that needle out, pull stuff down onto the cable. And then because I need to start with a yarn over, I'm actually going to bring this needle underneath the working yarn. So I'm going to let that working yarn lay across the front of the needle. And I'm just going to kind of cinch it there up next to the needle, and then I'm going to make this first stitch. Bring everything up on the shaft. Yarn over again. Go into this next stitch, which for some reason is not quite on this needle. All right, so knit this next stitch. All right, and now I can kind of cinch everything if I need to. I can pull the slack out, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 1. All right, and that is the end of round 2. So again, I'm going to slide everything back up onto both needles. And then to get ready to start round 3. So before I start round 3, before you start round 3, I have a recommendation for you. Okay, so my first recommendation is get a hold of some sort of beginning of round marker. This is what I'm going to be using. It is actually a row or round counting stitch marker. So I'll put it on the needles as my beginning of round marker. And essentially, as I'm working, so I'll put it on at the 3, and then when I get to it the next time, I'll just slip it. As I slip it, I'll slip to 4, and then I'll slip to 5, and slip to 6. So it's going to keep track of what round I'm on as I'm moving it. So this is linked in the video description below. I do not work for that company. I do not get any sort of financial compensation for telling you about these. I really love them. I feel like once I found them, it really changed how I knit, and just keeping track of rows, especially projects where counting rows is really important. It's so helpful to know what row or round you're on all the time. And so I would recommend getting some sort of beginning of round marker. It doesn't have to be anything like this, but you want to mark your beginning of round. And I would recommend getting 7 other stitch markers just before you start round 3. So I'm going to be using, these are called open jump rings. They're used for jewelry making. So technically it's a almost closed ring. There is a little tiny split in it. I don't know if you can even see the split. Right there. There's a little tiny split. So depending on where you get these, sometimes they come pretty open, like they've been twisted open. And so I'll link. I'll put a link in the video description to the ones that I got on Amazon. Again, I'm not giving affiliate links or anything like that. I don't get any kind of money for telling you about them. So the ones I get, they come in a set. Or the ones that I got off of Amazon, they're stainless steel. So far they haven't tarnished at all. They're nice and shiny, but they're just like slightly bigger than my needles, and they're very not in the way. So I do have stitch markers that I like that are very pretty that I use for other projects, but for projects where I have a lot of stitch markers, I just want something that's going to move easily and not be in the way. And so I really like the open jump rings for that. It's just like if you get them, let's see, in the jewelry section at Walmart, there's a really good chance that most of them you're going to have to twist closed, and they're not that easy to twist. So they can be hard on your fingers unless you actually have jewelry tools. Okay, so to start round 3, I'm actually going to make several adjustments as I'm working round 3. So the first adjustment I'm going to make is I'm going to be switching where my beginning of round is. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my last stitch from the previous round around here to be on this front needle before I even get started. And then once I work across the stitches on the front needle, I'm actually going to move the last stitch that I work on the front needle after I've worked it to the next needle. I'm going to slip it again. And what that's going to do is it's going to shift my stitches around one stitch. That's going to make it so that from this point forward, every time I start a round that begins with a yarn over, I'm never going to have to do a yarn over at the needle transition. And that's really going to help prevent ladders, because that yarn over, getting that yarn over the correct size each time is one of the big contributors to ending up with a ladder. And so if we shift the beginning of round now, you're never going to have to work that yarn over at the beginning of a needle change. So before I switch my stitch around, I am going to go ahead and put my round marker on here. I'm getting ready to start round 3. So I'm going to put it on the round 3. And then I'm going to bring, so if you're going to switch your stitches like I'm doing, bring the tail of your working yarn over your front needle and then loosen that stitch a little bit. So you can do this with a DPN. You just want to come, or another needle. So if you're going to move it with a needle, you could even use like a tapestry needle. Just make sure you come in from behind and pull it off and then move it around. Okay, so we want to move this stitch like we're moving it tip to tip. So what I do is I just grab it. So I just loosen it up, I pinch it from behind, pull it off the tip, and then come around to the front like that. Okay, and just stick it on there. And then pull your tail here so that it's tight. So this round, round 3, if you do this, is going to be the only round where your working yarn is not coming from the final stitch on the back needle towards you, like up around the needle towards you. This is going to be the one round where that doesn't happen, because this stitch, we've already worked it. And so when we get to it, we're just going to slip it. But because it's already been worked, it actually needs to just be coming from this needle instead of this needle. I hope that made sense. Okay, so for round 3, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to slip this first stitch, slip my stitch marker, or my round, beginning of round marker, and then I'm just going to knit 2, place a marker, knit 2, place a marker, knit 2, place a marker, all the way to the end. And then when I knit 2 at this very end, after I get done with this needle, I'm going to move this last stitch around to the other needle, just like I moved this first stitch over here, and then just continue through. And so what that's going to do, it's going to put the stitch markers is going to divide up the repeats. So from this point forward, every even numbered row has a repeated section, yarn over, knit a certain number of stitches. And so that certain number of stitches can also be read yarn over, knit to marker. And it's going to help you keep track of making sure that you didn't miss any stitches on the previous round. It's just gonna be a tool to help you stay on track and not end up with missed stitches at any point. Okay, so to begin round 3, I am going to pinch that stitch right here, but I don't really need to. So basically, the stitch that I would normally be pinching is actually on the front. So I am going to just hold this stitch back here, but I don't need to hold a whole lot of tension on the stitch back here because the stitch that I'm going to be working from is already going to be on my front needle. Okay, so I'm going to pull that needle out, come underneath. No, I'm not, sorry. Yes. So you want your working yarn to come over the cable at this point. All right, so just make sure it's coming from that stitch over the cable. Otherwise, you're going to create an accidental yarn over when you bring your needle underneath it. Okay, so slip that first stitch, get that up on the shaft. Just don't pull slack into it. Okay, and then slide your stitch marker, and then we're just going to knit 2. So knit these first couple of stitches nice and close. 1, 2. You can tug your yarn here if you need to, and then place a marker. And just repeat that. Knit 2, 1, 2. Place a stitch marker, knit 2, 1, 2. Place a stitch marker, knit 2, 1, 2. All right, now at this point, we need to switch to the other needle. All right, pull your tail over here to the left, put your working yarn over here to the right. And again, I'm going to move this stitch around to the other needle before I start. So I've already worked it. Again, I need my tail to come, I need to bring that tail over the needle before I move this stitch so I don't trap it in between there. All right, so I'm just going to pull a little slack into that, pinch it back here, pull it off, bring it around, and then get it on the shaft of that needle and just tighten it back up. And again, when I start working on this needle, I need my working yarn to be draped over my cable without it being trapped between my needles. And then I'm going to slip that first stitch. Okay. And so on this front needle, I did knit the 2. So I'm going to slip that second stitch that I knit. And then after I slip that, I'm going to put on a stitch marker. So hold that tension, pull your needle out, make sure that your yarn is coming over your cable here. All right, slip that first stitch purlwise, tip to tip. Just hold that tension where it is. Add a stitch marker. All right, grab my working yarn, and then I'm going to, very nice and close, I'm going to knit this first couple of stitches. So knit 2. After I knit that second stitch, I can tug if I need to, make sure there's no extra slack there. Place a stitch marker. Knit 2, 1, 2. Place a stitch marker. Knit 2, 1, 2. Place a stitch marker, and then knit 2. So 1 is going to be on this needle. It's going to seem like a big stitch. That is your yarn over from your previous round. Okay, don't worry about it. It's the right size. Don't worry about it, I promise. So knit that first stitch, and then the second stitch that we need to knit is actually going to be on the other needle again, because that's our end of round stitch. It's going to be the first stitch on the next needle when we get to it each time. So just know that from this point forward, to finish a repeat or to finish a round, your final stitch is always going to be on the next needle. So again, you can, just kind of reminding you, you can tuck that fabric down, pull it down, make sure your purl stitches are at the bottom edge of your needle. It should feel closer back here than it does up here. You should feel like there's more room up here than there is back here. But you shouldn't have any, it shouldn't be pulling on the left side. It shouldn't be pulling the needles underneath, one needle underneath the other one. And up here, there shouldn't be a giant gap. You shouldn't be able to pull your needles really, really far apart. Okay. Grab your tail, bring that back over here to the left. So once you make a little bit of fabric, this might be a little early, but basically you can take your tail. I just kind of wind it around my pinky a little bit, make a little ball of it. actually take it and just tuck it into that fabric that you're creating that's going down in between the needles, and it'll actually give you a little bit more of something to grab. Okay, so just a tip. Don't have to do it, but I find it useful. All right, so from here on out, we never have to make a yarn over at the beginning of a needle. We do need to finish round 3 because our last round 3 stitch is actually on this front needle. So after finishing round 3, I'm gonna work that last stitch, which is just a knit stitch. I'm gonna slip my stitch marker, and then round 4, where I'm gonna be working yarn over, knit 2, or yarn over, knit to the marker. So when I do this, I can just keep track and make sure that the previous round was correct. So there should be, after my yarn over, there should be 2 stitches to each marker. So pull my needle out. I am holding that tension on the back because I do need to work this next stitch. My needle comes underneath my working yarn. I'm going to work these first couple of stitches up nice and close again. So yarn over, making sure not to pull any extra tension to that stitch on the cable. All right, and then when I switch my stitch marker, it's going to be a little fiddly right here for the first couple of times just because I have to manually move it so as to not introduce extra slack. Yarn over, and then I'm going to knit 2. So this first one, that's my second knit stitch on the needle, so I can tug on that if I need to pull out any slack, and then knit that next stitch. And then from here on out, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, knit 2. 1, 2. Slip my stitch marker, yarn over, knit 2. 1, 2. Slip my stitch marker, yarn over, knit 2. So I'm going to knit 1 here, and then my 2 is going to be on this other needle. So switch needles again. So once you have the stitch markers on here, it can feel a little fussy to get your stitches back up onto your needle, just because sometimes, depending on the size of your stitch markers, sometimes they want to ride over the stitches. So you may need to just kind of put your stitches on one at a time for a couple of rounds. The further you get into this, the easier it's going to be. You just want to make sure that it's the stitch markers that are prohibiting the yarn from sliding back up onto the needle easily, and not a too tight stitch at the back that's doing that. All right, so I did the yarn over, I knit 1, I need to knit that second stitch of that set. So bring that, hold my tension on the back, bring my needle out, bring it under the working yarn, knit that second stitch. Doing this nice and close in my box. Yarn over, sorry, slip the stitch marker, then yarn over, knit 1. It's my second stitch on the needle, so I can tighten that if I need to. 2. Slip the stitch marker, yarn over, knit 2. 1, 2. Slip the stitch marker, yarn over, knit 2. 1, 2. Slip the stitch marker, yarn over, knit 1. And then again 2, which is going to be our last stitch of the round. It's going to be on the other needle. So I just find if you slip everything on in sets, so like stitch, stitch marker, set of stitches, stitch, stitch marker, set of stitches, it can be a little easier to get those stitches on there with the stitch markers until it loosens up a little bit. Okay. So to finish out round 4, I need to knit this last stitch on my front needle. So I'm going to hold the tension on the back needle, push it out, bring it under my working yarn, knit that last stitch. I totally just lost my grip back here, so I'm going to pull a little bit of slack into that stitch on the cable. So knit that last stitch, and then I'm going to switch my beginning of round marker here to round 5. Round 5, we're just going to knit around. So if you look at round 5, it just says knit around. So you're going to knit every stitch in this round. But if you look ahead to round 6, it says yarn over, knit 3. That knit 3, that's how many stitches, whatever it says after the K in the even numbered round following the odd numbered round. Whatever it says after the K, that's how many stitches you should have between stitch markers. So if it says knit 3, I should have 3 stitches between each of my stitch markers. 1, 2, 3. Slip my stitch marker, knit 3. 1, 2, 3. So if you're doing this and you come across a section where you have more stitches than you think you should, you want to check and make sure that your yarn over didn't migrate from the left side of the stitch marker to the right side. So that's usually what happens, is it moves over, and then you have too many, you get to too many stitches before you get to too few stitches. So if, for instance, I was working this last set and this yarn over here had migrated to the other side of the stitch marker, it would seem like I have 4 stitches, but then I could tell, wait, no, that's the yarn over. First of all, because the yarn over does look different than a knit stitch, but also because I would realize that I only have 2 stitches instead of the 3 that I need in the next set. So if you keep track of that, again, you shouldn't ever have to rip back really far because you missed a stitch or you had too many stitches. More commonly, it's because you missed a yarn over at some point, and sometimes you can just pick that up as you work. But doing it this way with the stitch markers is just going to kind of help you keep better track of where you are in the pattern, and to make sure as you're working each row or round that you're not off track, like that you didn't miss something in the previous round. All right, so slide everything back up onto your needles here. Pull tension on that back needle, pull that fabric down underneath. All right. So I have the 1, 2 from that set here, and then 3 is going to be on this needle here. So bring my needle out, come under the working yarn. There's 3. Slip my stitch marker, knit 1, 2, 3. Slip my stitch marker, 1, 2, 3. Slip my stitch marker, 1, 2, 3. Slip my stitch marker, 1, 2, and then 3 is going to be on the other needle. And that'll be the end of my round. All right, so grab your fabric, tug it down, grab your working yarn, snug that stitch. Just want to make sure everything's where it's supposed to be. To finish out round 5, I just need to work this last stitch on my front needle. And then round 6 is going to be yarn over, knit 3, which is also going to be yarn over, knit to the marker. So I should have 3 stitches between each of the markers. As a matter of fact, if you want, you can kind of glance ahead and make sure I got 3, 3, 3, 1, 2, 3, 3, 3, 3, 1, 2, 3. All right, so then you know the next round you just have to do yarn over, knit to marker all the way around. So snug my yarn back here, pull out my needle, need to knit this last stitch, slip my stitch marker to the next thing, and then so I do yarn over, and again I'm doing this nice and close so I don't introduce any extra slack or pull out too much slack. So yarn over, knit 3, 1, that's my second stitch on the needle, so if I need to I can snug that down, 2, 3, slip the stitch marker, yarn over, knit 3, 1, 2, 3, slip the stitch marker, yarn over, knit 3, 1, 2, 3, slip the stitch marker, yarn over, knit 3, 1, 2, 3 is going to be on that next needle. Tuck everything down, cinch that working yarn, hold tension on the back needle, pull that one out under the working yarn, work that third stitch of the set, slip my stitch marker, yarn over. I'm working this first couple of stitches really close, knit 3, 1, 2, 3, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, 1, 2, 3, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, 1, 2, 3, slip my stitch marker, yarn over, 1, 2, and then 3 is going to be on that next needle. Pull everything down in between. my tail's trying to poke out my yarn overs now. Okay, so to finish out this round, I'm just going to knit this first stitch on the front needle. And from here, so let me just, rather than working, so I am finishing out round 6, okay? All the way from round 7 through round 17, you're going to be doing the same thing. 2 rounds, every 2 rounds, you're going to be repeating basically the same thing. Okay, so rather than working all those rounds, let's just talk about those rounds. So after I finish this last stitch of the round, slip my beginning of round marker. For round 7 and all the odd numbered rounds from round 7 to round 17, you're just going to be knitting every stitch.
And if you want to make sure as you're working an odd numbered round, do I have the correct number of stitches between the markers? If you look ahead to the next even numbered round, so for round 7, look ahead to round 8. For round 9, look ahead to round 10. For round 11, look ahead to round 12, and so on. Find the number that follows knit or the K
in the yarn over knit a certain number of stitches instruction. Okay, that number is the number of stitches in this odd numbered round that you should have between the markers. So for round 7, between my markers, if I look ahead to round 8, I should have 4 stitches between each of the markers. And when it's this early on, you can just actually glance down and check, 4, 8, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's 16, there's 4 there, there's 4 there, there's 4 there, there's 3, and then the 4th one's up here. So for all the rounds that you're just knitting around, the number of stitches between the markers should be the same as the number of stitches that you knit after the yarn over in the next round. And then for the even numbered rounds, as you're after you finish an odd numbered round where you just knit all the way around, for every odd numbered round, you're just going to do yarn over, knit to the marker, or knit the number of stitches. So if your previous round was correct, if you just knit the number of stitches in each set, then you should just be able to knit to the marker or the number of stitches that it says. So rather than demonstrating yarn over knit to marker or yarn over knit a certain number of stitches all the way around for another 10 rows, I am going to jump ahead in the pattern here to round 18 where we do something different. Okay. It's just for time wise, it just doesn't seem, it's going to take me so long to make a video that shows all of those rounds up front. I didn't want to wait any longer than I already have to get this video put out. So, because I know people are going to ask, because I'm doing this on larger fabric, it is going to look like by the time I'm at round 18, I could be working this on a single short circular. Just know that if you're working with the recommended yarn and needles, it's actually going to be closer to round 23 before you have enough stitches on your setup to be able to make it around. So again, I'm not using this to demonstrate, just because between my needles being so shiny, the yarn being so shiny, and the yarn being tiny, it is really hard for you to see what I'm like. I've tried doing a video with this particular yarn and these particular needles. It's just, it doesn't show up very well. It's hard to see. And so I wanted you to be able to see what I'm doing. So that's why I'm not working on this. But this is the actual yarn. This is the actual needle size that's recommended. This is at round 23. Like, so if I were to continue right now, it would be working round 24. So this is about the point at which it makes sense to have a 16-inch setup. So this is two 4-inch needles on an 8-inch cable for a total of 16 inches. But even now, if I were to work around these stitches, I would basically have to stretch out the stitches that are on the cable here pretty far to get, so I always need like a couple of stitches up on my right needle and a couple of stitches up on my left needle to work. So I would be able to work here. It's just going to be kind of tight. Slip my beginning round marker here. See, this is one of the pretty ones I like. So as I'm knitting around, once I run out of stitches over here on my right needle, I basically have to stop and kind of move everything around. So that's about the earliest that it's going to make sense to move to just a plain circular setup, is around round 23. If that's what you want to do, that would be my recommendation. If you have access to either, so these are HiyaHiya. I think ChiaGoo makes fixed circulars that are really short too. These are 9-inch HiyaHiya needles, which are basically, I think it's 1.5 inches. Each tip is 1.5 inches long, which would make this a, what would that be? A 6-inch cable. So 6 inches of cable. You basically have to work every stitch like very tediously, I find, to work on these. But if you had those, you could probably switch around round 17 to something like that. Same thing with, so ChiaGoo has the shorties, which are, I think these are 3-inch. The whole setup is like 11 5/8 inches long. But the same thing, because the cable is so short, you have to hold your needles at a very odd angle. And so I feel like it's a lot fiddlier. You can't really hold your needles at the angle. So when I work into a stitch normally, I'm going at almost a 90-degree angle into that stitch. So it's kind of like this to go into a stitch. And so because the cable's so short, it's hard to get a good angle on the stitch without really having to stretch out everything on the cable. So you probably couldn't even switch to these until closer to like round 20, 19 or 21, which I don't know that the extra 2 rows is really worth trying to wrangle a shorty for any length of time. They're fine for socks, and if you just get in the rhythm of working with it, they're fine. But so just know, if you're looking forward to switching to just a short circular needle, around round 23 is where you're going to be able to do that. But like I said, I'm going to jump ahead and show you starting at round 18, and I'm just going to work a few rounds there to just get the sequence set up so that you understand how to work the even numbered rows from round 18 through round 30. Okay, so I'm at the end of round 17. I've got one more stitch to work before I finish round 17. But starting at round 18, the stitch pattern changes up a little bit. So we're still doing every other round, or every odd numbered round is just knit all the way around. But beginning with round 18 in the even numbered rounds, we're going to start with a sequence of yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together. So those yarn over, knit 2 togethers, we start with 1 in each set so we always do yarn over, knit 1 in each set on the even rows. But the yarn over, knit 2 starts with 1 set in round 18, and then 2 of those in round 20, and 3 of those in round 22, and 4 of those in round 24, and so on and so forth. So you're increasing each time you do a new even row, you're increasing the number of times you work the yarn over knit 2 together that follows the yarn over knit 1. And then after you work that sequence, the yarn over knit 1 and then however many yarn over knit 2 together sets, then you just knit again to the marker or that number of stitches. So from this point forward, you can do a couple of things to figure out, for instance, when you're working just the straight knit rounds, whether you have the correct number of stitches. So the easiest way is going to be just add notes into your pattern beginning at round 3, showing that you'll have 2 stitches between each of the markers, and that number increases by 1 on each subsequent odd numbered round. Another option would be look at the number in the parenthesis at the end of the even numbered rounds and divide that by 8. And then for each following odd numbered round, that number in parenthesis divided by 8, that's how many stitches are in each set all the way around. But essentially, that's, you can use the stitch markers to help keep you from getting off track. And I do think it's important that, especially when you're working these sequences where you have multiple yarn over and then a certain kind of stitch as you're working, in the next round, as you're working across each set, to make sure that you have the right number of stitches, because it's really easy to either forget to do a yarn over or do an extra yarn over, and it's a lot simpler to go back and either drop a yarn over or you can actually, as you're working, if you missed a yarn over, you can actually just pick one up from between the stitches. Basically all it is the yarn that's between the stitches is making the yarn over. All that to say, let's work round 18. So let me finish out round 17 here. Finish this last stitch, which is just a knit stitch. Slip my stitch marker. So round 18 we do, whoa, I messed that up. So instead of putting that all back on my needle, I'm just going to poke my needle in there to make that stitch on the cable the right size before I start back over here. All right, so that's the correct size. Get my stitch marker out of the way. All right, so yarn over, knit 1, and then I'm going to go ahead and tighten right there. So yarn over, knit 2 together. So yarn over, knit 1, and then yarn over, knit 2 stitches together. And if you've never done a knit 2 together, you basically, after the yarn over, take the tip of your needle, come in from left to right. So you've got 2 stitches on the needle, and you're going to go past that second stitch to the left side of that second stitch, and then in through both stitches from left to right, wrap your needle, pull that stitch through and onto the shaft. And then from there, we just knit 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Slip your stitch marker, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together, knit 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Slip your stitch marker, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together, knit 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Slip your stitch marker, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together, knit 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then my 6th stitch is going to be on my other needle. Push that back in. And yes, I am still pushing everything back up onto the needles before I proceed each time. But again, if you are comfortable with your tension and feel like you can get the correct tension without doing that, you could definitely, your fabric's not going to be long enough at this point to put it on, for instance, like the 16-inch setup where you have an 8-inch cable and 2 4-inch needles. But it is probably long enough that you could leave some of it on the cable and simply pull the cable out in different places as you're working around. So that is an option if you're not a fan of doing this every single time. I just think for the basically 23 rows, so 46 times that you need to do it before you can move to a just one long circular, it's worth it just to get good tension and not have to rip out because you ended up with ladders. This 6th knit stitch is on my front needle here. So I need to get that one knit. And then slip my stitch marker and then repeat, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together, knit 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Slip the stitch marker, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together, knit 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Slip the stitch marker, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together, knit 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Slip the stitch marker, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together, knit 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And number 6 is going to be on my other needle. Hate it when that happens. All right. So to finish out that round, just going to knit this last stitch on the front needle. Slip my round marker. And then this next round is just going to be knit around. So if you look at the end of round 18 where it says 80 stitches, that tells me that 80 divided by 8 means I'm going to have 10 stitches, or I should have 10 stitches between each of the markers in this round. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Slip your marker, 1, knock off a stitch and put it back, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Slip the marker, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Slip the marker, 1, 2, whoops. Pull stitches out, put them back on. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and of course my 10 is going to be on my next needle. So you just keep knitting all the way around every stitch to the end of round 19, and I will meet you at the beginning of round 20. Okay, so this is my last stitch of round 19. Slip my stitch marker, or my beginning of round marker. Round 20 starts with yarn over, knit 1, and then we're going to do the sequence yarn over, knit 2 together twice. So yarn over, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together, and then you should have 5 stitches from here to your marker. So knit those 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that repeated sequence again, yarn over, knit 1, and then yarn over, knit 2 together twice. So yarn over, knit 2 together once, yarn over, knit 2 together twice, and then knit 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And at this point you should be at your marker. Slip that, work the repeat, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together once, yarn over, knit 2 together twice, knit 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Repeat. So you're just going to work that repeat all the way around. Start with a yarn over, knit 1, work yarn over, knit 2 together twice. 1, 2, and then knit 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Next needle. Yes, with my yarn being significantly larger, I probably could be on a short circular by now. Just don't want to cheat and do something that you can't do yet. So, all right, so this 5th stitch is going to be on this front needle now. So, whoops. Yeah, sometimes when you don't let go of your yarn. 5. All right, slip the stitch marker and just continue with that repeat. Yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together twice. So it's once and twice, and then knit 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Slip the stitch marker, repeat, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together twice. 1, 2, knit 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Slip the stitch marker, repeat, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together, knit 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Slip marker, yarn over, knit 1, yarn over, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together, knit 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 is going to be on that front needle. So from this point, rather than, again, working through what you should be able to do on your own,
So next,
I'm going to work this next round. So it's going to be a little early for you. I would still recommend waiting until round 23 to start working on a short circular needle. But rather than work 2 more rounds on here and take up the time to do it, I am just going to do what I would do on round 23 if I was using the Oasis Camel Silk Fingering or a comparable size yarn, which is knit this next round onto my short circular, which is, this is, again, it's a 16-inch. So I have 4-inch needle tips on an 8-inch cable for a total of 16 inches. And so I am going to get everything set up like I would normally do. And then I'm just going to knit from the needles as they are here to get started. So I'm going to knit about 5 stitches onto my new needle with everything still, and I'm going to actually pull those back stitches a little bit closer so they're all up on the shaft. So knit that one, move my stitch marker, slash beginning of round marker, and then I'm just going to knit 4 more stitches here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm just going to knit those first 5 stitches that I have on here total, kind of up close to that back needle. And then I'm just going to pull it out, and I'm going to work as I normally would from the stitches that are on this left needle here. So I'm just knitting around. You can count your stitches as you're going if you're concerned that you missed something on the previous round. So for me, I should have 11 stitches between each marker. If you do this at round 23, you should have 12. So as you're knitting, you can just kind of slide the stitches that you've worked off the needle onto the cable. All right, so I do need these next stitches to be, so I was just working from this position, so I need to pull my longer needle so that the next set of stitches is kind of in the same orientation to my needle. So pull that through. And for the purposes here, I am still going to pull that last stitch up onto the needle just to make sure. But because that opposite stitch is down on the cable, it's not going to be as much of a feedback as to whether that was too tight. At this point, it's probably, if it's the only tight stitch you have, it's not going to make a difference. Just keep knitting. And if you want, counting your stitches between the markers to make sure you have the correct number and did the right sequence previously. Then once you have all your stitches knit onto that cable, you can just kind of spread them all out around the circular, and you should be able to go from there, just continuing on with the stitch pattern. The way that I do it, knitting onto the next needle, is not necessarily the only way to do it. You could, if you had all your stitches up on the 2 needles and nothing down on your cables, you could unscrew the cables and just replace them if you want to. I tend not to do that just because it is more likely I'm going to lose stitches off the end when I'm trying to work over here. As I'm twisting things around, there may be things sliding off the other end. So if you're going to do that, I would put something at the tips of your needles to keep the stitches from sliding off. But that is another way to switch your stitches, is to just get everything onto the needles and then switch out the cable. Assuming you have interchangeables and you're not working from fixed needles. If you are working with a long circular and you don't have the option to go down to a short circular around round 23 or so, my suggestion is, so at some point it is going to become unreasonable to try to slide all your stitches back up onto the needles at the end of a round. You're gonna end up with too many stitches to fit on the needles comfortably. You don't want to get in a situation where you push the needles off the end, or push the stitches off the end when you're trying to get everything up onto the needle. And so I would say around round 23, it doesn't have to be, it can be wherever it's comfortable for you. But if you have the longer circular, to leave some of your stitches on the cable and simply move the where the cable is coming at. So right now the cable's kind of coming out where my stitches are divided in half. But what you can do is you can work with some of the stitches down on the cable and then simply allow the cable to come together where the stitches are meeting. And basically, as you work around, when you use up, maybe a third or 2/3 of what's coming up onto the needle, when you get near the stitches that are where it's divided, coming close to the needle, you can basically pull the cable out closer to your right needle, and increase the number of stitches that are coming up onto your left needle. I do recommend when you do this to just put I like to use, again, a plastic locking stitch marker. So the thing is, if you try to bend your cable, like bend it together to poke it through the stitches, you will run the risk of causing a kink in your cable. And don't worry if your stitches stretch out slightly as you're pulling the slack. That's totally normal. They're going to be resilient. They're going to spring back. Where it says to fasten off color A at the end of round 36, that is if you are doing all of the color, like if you're doing 12 whole colors, or a 12 color set of, if you're switching yarn to work glue 2, then fasten off. It just means basically break the yarn. It doesn't mean you're not binding off any stitches. You're not, you're just getting rid of your color A yarn at that point. If you are continuing to work, if you're working all of it in one color, or you're working all of it in only 3 or 4 colors, continue with your current color. Don't break the yarn, don't cut the yarn, don't fasten it off, just leave it for clue 2.